It all started like any other ordinary day. The kind of day where you think nothing extraordinary will happen, where the rhythm of life hums along smoothly, without disruption. I woke up early, the sun barely creeping through the curtains, casting a soft glow on my room. There was a strange calmness in the air, one of those quiet moments where your mind races with possibilities but nothing concrete. I had a flight to catch, a routine business trip, or so I thought. I remember the feeling of packing my bag the night before, folding my clothes carefully, slipping in my essentials, my travel documents, and my lucky charm, a small token I never travel without. As I zipped up the suitcase, I told myself I would be back soon, maybe a week at most. The plans ahead were simple: meetings, a bit of exploring a new city, and then home again. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that could have prepared me for what was about to happen. The drive to the airport was uneventful. I sat quietly in the back seat of the cab, staring out the window as familiar streets blurred past. I could feel a slight nervous energy, not from fear, but from anticipation. Airports always carry that electric buzz, a mixture of excitement and routine, anxiety and anticipation all tangled together. At the terminal, I checked in, past security, and found myself waiting at the gate. People were chatting around me, families hugging, business travelers tapping on laptops, children tugging at their parents' sleeves. I took a deep breath and settled into my seat, pulling out a book to distract myself. But my mind kept wandering. I found myself watching the planes taxiing on the runway, wondering about the stories they carried. Each plane a vessel of countless dreams, hopes, lives intersecting briefly in the vast sky. The boarding call came, a polite voice echoing through the speakers. One by one, passengers rose, forming lines, scanning boarding passes. I joined them, feeling the familiar sense of routine. I remember stepping onto the plane, finding my seat by the window, and watching as the cabin filled with murmurs and the clatter of carry-ons. The flight attendants smiled and moved gracefully through the aisle, their practiced calmness almost contagious. As the engines roared to life, I felt the subtle vibration beneath my feet, the plane moving forward. The moment the wheels left the ground, I looked out the window and saw the familiar landscape shrinking, the city fading away beneath a blanket of clouds. For a while, everything was perfect. The hum of the engines, the soft chatter of passengers, the occasional announcement over the intercom. I closed my eyes and let myself relax. I thought about my family, my friends, the life I had waiting for me on the other side of this flight. It was a flight like any other. But then things started to change. The subtle shudder in the cabin, the quick dip that made my stomach lurch, the sudden jolt that rattled the entire aircraft. At first, I thought it was just turbulence, a common inconvenience on many flights. But then, the air seemed to grow heavier, the noises sharper, the tension palpable. The captain's voice came on the intercom, calm but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and stay seated." My heart pounded louder than the engines. I gripped the armrests tightly, my knuckles whitening. Around me, whispers of concern rippled through the cabin. Eyes met, searching for reassurance. Minutes passed like hours. The plane shook again, harder this time, and the overhead lights flickered. Oxygen masks dropped from above, swaying gently in the air. Panic began to rise in the collective breath of the passengers. I pulled the mask to my face, trying to steady my breathing. Fear was creeping in, cold and relentless. Then came the worst moment, the impact. The world turned upside down. The deafening roar of metal against earth, the screeching and crashing, the chaos of movement and sound. I felt thrown forward, then back. pain exploding through my body as the plane tore through the trees and ground. Everything became a blur. Shouts, cries, the smell of smoke and fuel. When the noise finally stopped, there was silence, eerie and complete. The world around me was unrecognizable. Twisted metal, shattered glass, broken limbs of trees everywhere. Smoke curled upward in thin spirals against a gray sky. I was alive, but how? How did I survive that? I tried to move, pain radiating through my body, every breath a battle. My fingers touched my face, blood. My clothes were torn, my shoes missing. Around me, other passengers were groaning, crying, some silent, some calling for help. The reality of the crash was sinking in, sharp and unforgiving. I sat there, in the wreckage, heart racing, mind spinning. How had my life led to this moment? What was I supposed to do now? The normal world I had known was gone. This was survival, raw, brutal, and immediate. As the shock slowly wore off, a new determination took its place. I had to move, had to find help, had to stay alive. I forced myself to stand, legs shaking beneath me, scanning the area for anything familiar, anything that could guide me. The forest around us was dense, the trees towering and thick with leaves. The crash site was a chaotic mess, fire still smoldering in some spots, debris scattered for hundreds of meters. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that made the scene even more surreal. I knew then that the real journey was just beginning, not just the fight to stay alive in this wilderness, but the struggle to overcome fear, pain, and despair. I had to summon every ounce of strength, every fragment of courage buried deep inside. And so, with a deep breath, I took my first step away from the wreckage into the unknown. After the crash, everything felt surreal, like I was trapped inside a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The shock dulled some of the pain, but my mind was racing faster than ever. I kept replaying that moment over and over, the sudden jolt, the violent shaking, the terrifying sound of metal twisting and snapping. How quickly a peaceful flight turned into absolute chaos. I remember the taste of smoke in my mouth, acrid, sharp, choking. My throat burned as I struggled to breathe clearly. Each inhalation felt like it was scraping the inside of my lungs. The acrid smell of burning fuel and scorched earth surrounded me. It was suffocating, but I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself to breathe slowly, to focus. Around me, the groans and cries of other survivors echoed. Some were unconscious. Others were trying to move, calling out for loved ones. I tried to call back, but my voice was hoarse and weak. Panic was spreading among us like wildfire. I wanted to help, but my own body was screaming in pain. I pressed my hands against a bleeding wound on my arm, feeling the warm trickle of blood drip down my fingers. The adrenaline coursing through me masked the full extent of my injuries. But I knew I was hurt badly. Every movement was agony. Yet, the instinct to survive pushed me forward. I looked around for anything that could help, a first aid kit, a piece of metal to cut through the wreckage, or even a phone. But everything was smashed, broken, or lost in the chaos. The plane's cabin was no longer a safe space. It was a deadly trap. Time felt warped. Minutes stretched endlessly as I tried to gather my senses and plan my next move. My legs trembled under me as I forced myself to stand, gripping twisted metal for support. I knew I couldn't stay there. Fire could spread, or the wreckage could collapse. Staying meant death. The forest surrounding the crash was dense and darkening, rapidly as the sun began to dip. Below the horizon, shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped quickly. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold on to any warmth. I had no idea where to go, no compass, no clear path. The only thing I knew for certain was that I had to keep moving. I scanned the area, searching for landmarks, a clearing, a stream, or signs of a trail. I remember the sound of insects beginning their evening chorus, and the distant hoot of an owl. The wilderness was waking up, and I was alone, vulnerable, and scared. My mind raced through everything I'd learned about survival: stay calm, find water, make shelter, signal for help. But in that moment, those words felt like distant lessons from a textbook, not practical guides for the raw reality I faced. As darkness settled in, fear crept into my thoughts. What if no one was coming? What if I was the only one left alive? The thought was terrifying. I fought back tears, swallowing my panic and focusing on the present. I decided to gather whatever I could carry from the wreckage: a backpack with some emergency supplies, my jacket, a flashlight with fading batteries. Every item was precious, a lifeline. The first night in the forest was the hardest. The cold seeped into my bones, and every sound made my heart leap. I tried to find a sheltered spot to rest, using branches and leaves to create a makeshift cover. Sleep was elusive. My mind kept replaying the crash, the faces of the other passengers, the sudden shift from normalcy to disaster. I thought about my family, wondering if they knew what had happened. The guilt and fear weighed heavily. But beneath the fear was a flicker of determination, a stubborn will to live, to fight through the nightmare. I whispered to myself that I would make it through. I had to. Through the long, cold hours, I planned. I thought about what I would do in the morning: find water, build a fire, search for help. I knew survival was a game of patience, endurance, and hope. This was only the beginning of a journey that would test me in ways I never imagined. A journey that would change me forever. I'll begin where left off, with the calm before the storm, and then take you deep into those terrifying seconds that shattered my world. It started with a familiar hum, the steady rhythm of the engines pushing US through the sky. Outside my window, the clouds drifted lazily by, bright and fluffy. I tried to focus on the book in my hands, but my eyes kept wandering, watching the landscape shrink beneath us. At first, there was nothing unusual: the routine chatter of passengers, the distant clink of drink carts, the soft footsteps of flight attendants. A kind of ordinary calm settled over the cabin. I was halfway between relaxed and alert, feeling that odd mix of boredom and anticipation that often comes with flying. But then something shifted. It was subtle at first. A small vibration, a quick shudder beneath my feet. Nothing major, just the kind of turbulence that shakes you awake for a moment before settling down. The plane rocked gently, a little more violently than usual, and then a sharp jolt that made my heart leap. Around me, people shifted uneasily in their seats. Some gripped the armrests. Others exchanged nervous glances. The flight attendants paused mid-step, their smiles faltering just a little. The air felt charged, like the moment right before a storm breaks. Then the plane lurched again, harder this time. The lights flickered briefly. The hum of the engines turned into a grinding roar. I felt my stomach drop, as if the ground beneath us had vanished. I clutched the seat in front of me, knuckles white, breath caught in my throat. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Calm, professional, but with an edge I hadn't heard before. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my pounding heart. I glanced around, noticing the tension spreading like wildfire. The passengers' faces turned pale. Some whispered prayers. Others stared wide-eyed, frozen in place. Suddenly, the plane dropped again, a sharp, terrifying dip that made the cabin lurch violently. People gasped, screams rising in a wave. The oxygen masks dropped, swinging like pendulums from the ceiling. I grabbed mine instinctively, pulling it over my nose and mouth. gasping for steady breaths. My ears popped painfully as the pressure shifted. The sound of metal creaking filled the cabin. The unmistakable groan of a machine pushed beyond its limits. I felt the plane shaking uncontrollably now, twisting, tilting. Panic exploded around me. Screams, cries, the sound of things crashing against walls. The impact came suddenly, like a nightmare made real. I was thrown forward, then slammed back into my seat. My body jolted violently. The world spun wildly. I heard the roar of tearing metal, the sickening crunch as the plane smashed into the ground. Trees scraping against the fuselage like claws. The cabin lights flickered, then went out, plunging us into darkness broken only by sparks and flashes. I gritted my teeth, bracing myself against the chaos. My ears rang. My lungs burned from the smoke flooding in. The smell of burning fuel was overwhelming, thick, choking, suffocating. Around me, the sounds of destruction were deafening, glass shattering, seats twisting, overhead bins bursting open. I felt hands grab mine, tight, desperate grips reaching out in the dark. People cried out, begged, cursed. Some were screaming for loved ones. Others were silent, frozen by shock. I lost track of time. Seconds, minutes, everything blurred into a terrifying whirlpool of noise, pain, and fear. When the shaking finally stopped, an eerie silence fell. My ears were ringing, my body bruised and aching. I was dazed, disoriented. The world around me was unrecognizable, a twisted maze of broken seats, jagged metal, and smoke curling upward. I tried to move, but my limbs were heavy, numb. My head throbbed, vision blurred. I tasted blood in my mouth. Every breath was a struggle. I realized I was still alive, somehow, miraculously, still alive. The moment of impact wasn't just a physical collision. It was the shattering of everything I knew. A fracture in time where normal life ended and survival began. I could feel it deep inside, a primal spark that refused to die. That spark would carry me forward through pain, fear, and despair. But in that moment, all I could do was hold on. When the chaos finally settled, and the deafening roar faded into an eerie silence, I was left sitting in a wreckage that no longer resembled an airplane but a twisted, broken shell of metal and memories. The smell of smoke and fuel hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sharp scent of pine and earth from the forest that had swallowed our plane whole. For a moment, I just sat there, stunned, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The world around me was still and quiet, but that silence was deceptive, filled with an almost unbearable weight. I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I was alive. I tried to move, testing my limbs cautiously. Sharp pain shot through my body, my right arm throbbed, and I could feel a wet warmth where blood seeped through my torn shirt. My head was pounding, vision blurry, and every breath burned my lungs. But I was breathing. That was something. I looked around the cabin. The interior was a nightmare of twisted metal, broken seats, scattered belongings, and injured passengers. Some were unconscious. Others were groaning or crying out. The atmosphere was thick with fear and confusion. Faces streaked with dirt and blood stared back at me, eyes wide, searching for answers that didn't come. I couldn't just sit there. The fire that had been sparking near the engine compartment was now spreading slowly, smoke curling through the cabin and making it hard to breathe. Panic threatened to rise again, but I forced it down. I had to think. I had to act. I shifted carefully, ignoring the sharp pain in my ribs, and tried to stand. My legs wobbled beneath me, but I was determined. The outside world was a dense forest, dark and unfamiliar, but it was safety compared to the burning wreckage. I needed to get out. The door was jammed, warped by the crash. The window was shattered. Using a broken piece of metal from a seat frame, I pried at the door frame until it gave way with a terrifying creak. The cold air hit me like a wave. Relief flooded through me, sharp and immediate. I stumbled out into the forest, the canopy thick with towering trees and thick underbrush. The ground was uneven, littered with branches and debris. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows that twisted like ghosts among the trees. I turned back for a moment, my chest tightening at the sight of the wreckage. Flames were licking higher now, smoke billowing into the sky. I had to move fast. Around me, I heard faint cries and calls. Others had made it out, but they were scattered, injured, and disoriented. I called out, my voice hoarse but urgent. Some answered. Others didn't. The reality of the disaster was settling, like a heavy fog over us all. In that moment, the world felt utterly broken, lives torn apart in an instant. Normalcy ripped away like fragile paper. I was no longer just a passenger on a flight. I was a survivor, facing the raw, unforgiving wilderness with nothing but my wits and will. I checked my injuries again. Blood stained my hands. My clothes were torn and soaked with sweat and grime. Hunger gnawed faintly at my stomach, but it was the cold and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. As night fell, the forest transformed. The comforting sounds of daytime birdsong were replaced by eerie rustles, distant howls, and the crackling of twigs under unseen feet. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound magnified in the darkness. I knew then that survival wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about mastering fear, mastering the unknown. The forest was vast and wild, indifferent to my plight. I had to learn its rhythms, its dangers, and its secrets, or be swallowed by it. I gathered what I could from the wreckage: a small backpack, a water bottle, a flashlight with fading batteries. Every item was precious. I fashioned a crude bandage for my arm, pressing tightly to slow the bleeding. My thoughts turned to my family, their faces flashing in my mind's eye. I promised myself I would find a way back to them. That promise became my anchor, a beacon in the darkness. The night was long and cold. I tried to build a small fire using twigs and dry leaves scavenged from nearby. The flickering flames offered a fragile comfort, warding off the chill and some of the forest's ominous silence. Sleep was impossible. Every crack of a branch, every distant animal call sent jolts of adrenaline through me. I lay awake, listening, waiting, planning. The crash had changed everything. The life I had known was gone, replaced by this stark, relentless fight for survival. The moments after the crash blurred into an endless stretch of raw, unfiltered reality. There was no time to grieve, no time to panic, only the urgent, pressing need to survive. Pain radiated through my body, but even that was secondary to the clear, undeniable instinct to keep moving, to find safety, to do whatever it took to live. I remember the sharp sting of blood drying on my skin, the constant ache of bruises forming across my chest and legs. But the forest was alive all around me, and every sound seemed to whisper threats: the rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the distant calls of unknown animals. Survival wasn't just about escaping the wreckage. It was about navigating this new, wild world that had become my prison. The first order of business was to tend to my wounds as best I could. My hands were trembling, but I used strips torn from my shirt to bind my bleeding arm. I cleaned the cuts with water I found in a nearby stream, hoping to stave off infection. I knew that the pain I felt now could only grow worse if I didn't act. I scavenged the crash site for supplies. In the chaos, I found a small backpack with some basic first aid items, bandages, antiseptic wipes, and a pocket knife. It wasn't much, but it was more than I expected. Each small tool felt like a lifeline. The cold night was closing in fast. Without proper shelter or warmth, survival would become impossible. Using fallen branches, leaves, and bits of fabric from the wreckage, I constructed a makeshift shelter. It wasn't much, just enough to shield me from the biting wind and possible rain. I worked quickly, driven by a mix of fear and determination. Fire was crucial. I needed heat, light, and a way to signal for help. Using the pocket knife, I gathered dry twigs and bark. I struck sparks against a rock for what felt like hours, my hands blistered and sore. Finally, a small flame caught, flickering weakly in the darkness. That tiny fire became my fortress against the overwhelming cold and the deep silence of the forest. Food was another challenge. My stomach growled, but I knew I couldn't risk eating anything without knowing if it was safe. I recalled survival training, which plants were edible, which were poisonous. I found some berries and wild greens and cautiously nibbled, aware that this was a delicate gamble. Water was paramount. Dehydration can kill faster than hunger, so I prioritized finding a clean water source. I followed the sound of running water until I located a small stream. I drank greedily, but I knew that untreated water could carry dangerous bacteria. I boiled water over the fire whenever I could, trying to purify it. Every decision felt monumental. Every choice could mean the difference between life and death. Sleep remained elusive. The forest was alive with sounds, some comforting, others threatening. I trained my ears to recognize what was normal and what was dangerous. I learned to control my breathing and calm my racing heart so I could rest, even briefly. Loneliness was perhaps the hardest battle. The silence of the forest pressed against me, a constant reminder that I was alone. Memories of friends, family, and life before the crash filled my mind, sometimes offering comfort, other times sharp pain. I clung to hope like a lifeline, reminding myself that rescue was possible. Each day was a fight against exhaustion, hunger, fear, and injury. But with every sunrise, I found renewed strength. I learned to listen to the forest, to observe its rhythms, and to respect its dangers. I kept moving forward, step by step, breath by breath, driven by the unshakable will to survive. The forest around me was beautiful and deadly, a paradox that became clearer with every passing moment. The towering trees stretched endlessly above, their leaves forming a thick canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft, green shadows. But beneath that peaceful surface lurked dangers I had never imagined. The first challenge was understanding where I was. After the crash, I had no idea if I was near civilization or deep in the wilderness. The landscape was unfamiliar, a tangle of trees, rocks and underbrush stretching in every direction. Every step felt heavy with uncertainty. The weather was unpredictable. The day started warm, but by late afternoon, thick clouds rolled in, blotting out the sun. A sudden storm hit, fierce winds whipped through the branches, and rain hammered down in relentless sheets. My makeshift shelter, barely holding together, became a desperate refuge against the cold and wet. Water was everywhere, dripping from leaves, pooling in small depressions, running in streams, but finding clean, safe water was another matter entirely. I learned quickly that not all water was drinkable. I boiled what I could, but fire was a precious resource I had to use sparingly. Food was scarce. The forest offered berries and plants, but many were unfamiliar and potentially poisonous. I relied on knowledge gleaned from survival guides and instincts sharpened by fear. Small animals rustled in the undergrowth, rabbits, squirrels, maybe even birds, but hunting them without tools was nearly impossible. The nights were the hardest. Darkness transformed the forest into a realm of shadows and sounds. Strange noises echoed all around, the howling of distant wolves, the rustling of unseen creatures, the snapping of twigs underfoot. Every noise set my heart racing. Cold seeped into my bones. I huddled near the fire, wrapping myself in tattered clothing, trying to hold on to warmth. Exhaustion tugged at my eyelids, but sleep was always tentative, broken by fear and discomfort. Every day was a lesson about patience, observation, and respect for nature's power. I learned to watch the sun and stars to keep track of time. I studied animal tracks and listened for signs of water or human activity. Every small discovery was a victory. The environment was unforgiving, but it was also my teacher. It demanded resilience, creativity, and courage. And slowly I adapted. The silence was the loudest thing I'd ever experienced. After the crash, the chaos had eventually settled into an eerie stillness. But that stillness wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, thick with absence. The absence of voices, of movement, of the normal hum of life. The forest stretched endlessly around me, dark and indifferent. Each day, as I faced the elements and searched for ways to survive, the solitude gnawed at my mind like a slow poison. Loneliness was a new kind of challenge, one that crept beneath my skin, filling every corner of my thoughts. It wasn't just being physically alone. It was the feeling of being cut off from the world, from everything and everyone I loved. I thought about my family constantly. Their faces flashed before my eyes, my mother's gentle smile, my father's steady hands, my friends' laughter. The ache of missing them was overwhelming. At night, the darkness played tricks on my mind. Shadows became monsters. Every sound was amplified. A branch snapping sounded like footsteps. A distant animal call like a scream. Fear was no longer just about survival in the physical sense. It became a battle within my own mind. The fear of dying alone, of never being found, of fading into oblivion. But even as fear tried to consume me, I fought back. I reminded myself of why I had to keep going. Hope became a fragile light in the darkness. I developed rituals to keep my mind sharp, talking aloud, counting breaths, repeating prayers. I clung to memories and dreams, weaving them into a shield against despair. Each day was a struggle between giving in to the crushing weight of loneliness and rising above it. And slowly, I learned that survival was as much about fighting the silence inside as the dangers outside. After days alone in the wilderness, the desperate need to be found became my single driving force. Survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about escaping. Being rescued meant returning to the world I'd lost, to the people I loved. But how could I make sure they found me? I knew that signaling was my lifeline. The first thing I did was create visible signs in the clearing near my shelter. Using rocks, logs, and anything bright or reflective, I made large shapes that could be spotted from the air. The universal distress signal, an enormous SOS, carefully laid out so that if a plane flew overhead, they wouldn't miss it. I remembered from survival guides that smoke was one of the best ways to catch attention. Every day I built smoky fires, using damp leaves and green branches to create thick, billowing smoke. I learned to control the fire, keeping it safe but visible. The hope that someone might see that smoke kept me going through the long hours. I also used any reflective objects I could find, bits of broken glass, aluminum from the plane, even my watch face, to catch sunlight and flash signals. I practiced angling these flashes towards the sky, hoping to catch the eye of a passing aircraft or search party. As days turned to nights, I discovered the power of sound. I made noise, banging rocks together, shouting, using whatever I could to create sounds that might carry through the trees. Exhaustion made it hard, but I pushed myself to keep trying. I mapped the area, noting landmarks, a river bend, a rock formation, a fallen tree, so I could remember where my signals were and improve them. I also tried to stay visible. When rescue helicopters flew close, I waved anything bright, shouted until my voice was hoarse, and made myself as noticeable as possible. Despite my efforts, hours passed without rescue. Each day brought a mix of hope and disappointment. But I refused to give up. The strategies I developed were my lifeline, proof that I was still fighting, still here. Through trial and error, I became more resourceful, learning from every mistake. I learned the importance of patience and persistence in the cruel calculus of survival. Every signal I made was a message, not just to the outside world, but to myself, that I was alive, that I mattered, and that I would be found. I don't think I truly understood how thin the line between life and death was, until I nearly crossed it. That day started like most others, cold, damp, and desperate. I had gone farther than usual, tracking a stream that I hoped might lead to help or at least to cleaner water. My legs were weak from days of rationed food and restless sleep. But something in me pushed forward. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was madness. The forest thickened the farther I went. The underbrush clawed at my clothes. Thorny vines scratched at my skin. My boots were barely holding together, soaked and soft, offering little protection. That's when I saw it, a ledge high above the riverbed. If I could get up there, I thought, I might see something, a road, a cabin, smoke, anything that could lead to rescue. I climbed, slowly, carelessly. I used roots and rocks for handholds, ignoring how slippery they were. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as my arms trembled with effort. And then, it happened. The roots snapped. I fell. I didn't even have time to scream before my body slammed against a lower ledge, bounced, and then crashed onto the rocky slope below. Everything went black for a moment. When I opened my eyes, pain exploded across my body. My right leg was twisted at a strange angle. Blood oozed from a deep gash on my forehead. I couldn't move my arm. For a while, I didn't care. Lying there, broken and alone, I wondered if this was it, if the mountain had finally claimed me. But something inside me, some stubborn ember, refused to let go. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. I ran my good hand over my body, checking for the worst injuries. My ankle was sprained or fractured. My ribs were bruised or broken, and my head was bleeding badly. But I was alive. Crawling became my only option. Inch by inch, through blinding pain, I pulled myself back toward the base of the cliff. My vision swam. I vomited more than once, but I moved. I used a branch as a crutch and tied my leg with strips of torn clothing. It wasn't perfect, but it kept me upright. Every step was agony. Every breath tasted like fire and mud. Back at my shelter, I collapsed. Fever came quickly, and for days I drifted in and out of consciousness. I was too weak to gather food, too dizzy to even stand. The infection spread, and hallucinations began, faces in the trees, voices whispering from the fire. I truly believed I wouldn't survive, but somehow I did. The brush with death taught me something I hadn't understood before. It wasn't about being strong. It was about refusing to surrender, even when your body has nothing left, even when your mind begs to quit. That cliff didn't kill me. It baptized me into a different kind of survival, one that burns from the inside out. And from that moment on, I knew I wouldn't stop fighting. I woke that morning feeling different, not stronger, not healthier, but clearer. The fever had broken sometime during the night. My dreams had quieted, and the whispering hallucinations that had haunted me for days had finally faded. For the first time in what felt like forever, I opened my eyes and felt present, like I was really here. not floating somewhere between life and death. My body still ached in every possible way. My leg throbbed constantly. My ribs protested even the slightest breath. But my mind was steady. And that was when I noticed something strange. Silence. The forest had always been alive with subtle sound, birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves whispering in the wind. But that morning, there was only stillness. The kind of silence that made your skin prickle. I dragged myself out of the shelter I had built with so much effort. My makeshift crutch wobbled under me as I hobbled to the clearing, the one where I had built the giant SOS out of branches and rocks. That's when I heard it. A distant hum. Low, mechanical, faint, but unmistakable. I froze. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. A helicopter. I looked up and saw it, a small dot on the horizon, slowly growing larger. I panicked. My fire. It had burned out in the night. Smoke was everything. Without it, they'd never see me. I moved faster than I had in days. Pain be damned. I threw dry leaves into the fire pit, grabbed twigs with shaking hands, and used the last ember from the previous night's coals to spark a flame. I blew until I was lightheaded, feeding the fire with damp moss and green branches. The smoke came, thick and gray, rising into the sky in a desperate spiral. The helicopter was closer now, circling, hovering. I waved my arms wildly, screamed with every ounce of energy I had. I grabbed a reflective shard from the wreckage and angled it toward the sun, flashing signals into the air. And then it turned, directly toward me. I collapsed in the clearing, sobbing, choking on the smoke and the emotion. They had seen me. They were coming. I don't remember much after that. I vaguely recall the downdraft of the rotors flattening the trees around me, the shout of men jumping out, the rush of voices calling my name. I remember being lifted into the air, the sensation of leaving the ground, not just physically, but spiritually, as if I were being lifted from a grave I had barely escaped. Inside the chopper, wrapped in blankets, I wept. Not from pain, not even from relief, but from the overwhelming realization that I was going home. I had survived. I had been broken, burned, bruised, and buried in despair, and still I had survived. That day changed everything. People think the end of the story comes when you're rescued, when the helicopter lifts you away from the wreckage, when the painkillers kick in, when the doctors wrap you in blankets and IVs and words like, "You're safe now." But survival doesn't end with rescue. Sometimes that's just where the real fight begins. I spent the first 3 weeks in a hospital bed. My leg had multiple fractures. They inserted pins, screws, and plates. My arm had torn ligaments. My ribs, as I feared, were cracked. 2 of them had even punctured a lung. But the physical wounds, as brutal as they were, weren't the ones that kept me up at night. It was the silence that returned once the chaos ended. The silence of waiting rooms. The sterile stillness of hospital lights that never dimmed. The white noise of machines that kept beeping, reminding me I was alive, but not yet living. They called it PTSD. I called it something worse, remembering. I remembered every minute, every second of being out there. The taste of rain on my tongue, the sound of bones cracking as I fell, the smell of burning plastic and scorched skin, and the voice inside me that kept whispering, "You almost didn't make it." People came. Reporters, family, friends I hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone wanted to know. Everyone wanted the story. They wanted to hear about the crash, the days in the wilderness, the miracle rescue. But no one wanted to hear about the nights I spent screaming into a pillow, or how I would wake up in cold sweats, convinced I was still in the forest, or how the sound of a distant plane overhead made me collapse, shaking. They saw the survivor, the fighter. They didn't see the shell. Rehabilitation was hell. Learning to walk again on that leg was like reliving the pain in slow motion. Every step was a war. Physical therapy pushed me to limits I didn't know existed. But still, I fought, because I had to prove to myself, to the world, that I was still here. Some days I resented that I had survived. Others, I felt this strange, sacred gratitude for things I had once ignored: sunlight on my face, the sound of laughter, warm socks, clean water. I started writing, not for the public, just for myself. I filled journals with thoughts I couldn't say aloud: guilt, grief, fear, hope. It was messy, but it was real. And real was what I needed. Eventually, I returned to the crash site. Not alone, with 2 rangers and a trauma therapist. I wanted to see it, to face it. The forest hadn't changed, but I had. I stood in the exact place where the plane had torn through the trees, where I had crawled from the wreckage, coughing up smoke, where I had screamed for help that didn't come. And I thanked it. I thanked that broken patch of earth for not burying me, for teaching me what it meant to be alive. Today I speak to people, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as someone who was forged in fire and rebuilt in silence. I tell my story because there are others like me, people who are lost in their own wilderness, waiting for the helicopter that may never come. I tell them, you can still fight. You can still come home. Not every scar is visible, but every scar tells a story, and every story can heal. I'm not the same person I was before that flight, but I've learned that sometimes you have to fall out of the sky to learn how to stand on your own. I didn't just survive a plane crash. I survived everything that came after. And that's the part I'm most proud of.